Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chairman of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. This is the usual monthly commentary on global monetary and financial trends. It's just before Christmas 2019, and one might ask whether I can give you any tidings of comfort and joy. Well, I want to focus on one nation where economic conditions are improving dramatically and prospects for 2020 are much better than for 2019, and indeed the next few years should be better than the last few. The country is Greece, where there has been a miracle in the public debt, or at any rate in the management of the public debt. And things are much better now than they were in the crisis 4 or 5 years ago. I'm going to start this story going back to when Greece joined the euro in 2001, and I'm afraid I must start it with a story about lying. The Greek public finances have been in a bit of a mess for some time, and the Greek government misled the European authorities about the size of its public debt and its budget deficits. This rolled on to a greater or lesser degree for the next decade or so, and by the time of the great financial crisis, 2008-2009, the tendency to produce misleading figures was systematic. In 2008 and 2009, this was accompanied by extravagance. The Greek government increased its public spending very sharply, presumably hoping that the extra spending would boost economic activity in the usual supposed Keynesian manner. And indeed, this move into deficit had the support of international authorities in the sense that part of what was going on at that time was worldwide Keynesian fiscal expansion, or so-called fiscal expansion, with a wider budget deficit. Anyhow, what happened in Greece was that the deficit moved out from about 5% of GDP in 2007 to no less than 15% in 2009. In early 2010, the European Central Bank restricted some of the lending it had been doing to banks across the Eurozone to help them through the crisis. The result was that banks sold off government debt, and in the Greek case, there was heavy sales of Greek government debt by both Greek banks and banks all over Europe, and the yield on Greek government debt started to rise. This also coincided with a wider realization that the Greek government had been understating its deficits and understating its debts. So the yield on government debt started to rise very sharply. The confidence of the financial markets had been lost, and the increase in the interest on the debt meant that in future, as new issues of government debt came along, a higher interest rate would have to be paid. That was part itself of government spending. The higher government spending meant that deficits would be increased, and so there was a kind of Frankenstein monster in which the growth of the debt interest was itself causing the future growth of debt and then even more debt interest, and it's running out of control. Now, what I've got here is a chart of interest payments on Greek government debt in this period. Early on in the period when Greece joined the euro, interest payments came down and that was all very benign. And then you can see that they were shooting upwards in 2008, 9 and 10 and threatening again these interest payments on the debt, not useful government spending, they're threatening to exceed 10% of GDP. In fact, in 2011, the interest payments were themselves over 7% of GDP, reflecting this rise in the interest rate on the government debt and then also the surge in the government debt itself. The crisis became so bad that in July 2011, the Greek government defaulted on about half of its total debt, including all the debt held by private sector organizations, pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and so on. It didn't default on debt held by other central banks or on the IMF or other European governments. The result of that was, as you can see, in 2012, a drop in interest payments on the debt. But by early 2012, there had been such a collapse in confidence about the Greek position that the yield on Greek government debt in the financial markets, the 10-year government debt, rose to over 30%. Let's just think about that a bit more. The Greek government had been lying about the size of its debt, telling people the debt was not much more than GDP. In fact, the debt was rising towards 140% of GDP. The interest payments in future would be affected as the debt was being redeemed and new debt was being incurred by this 30% figure. So that potentially you had interest payments on the debt reaching 140% of GDP multiplied by 30%, over 40% of GDP. The Greek government was in fact completely bust. Well, at this point, of course, there was much alarm in the financial markets about what was going on. A left-wing government was elected under a chap called Tsipras, the Syriza government, and there was a lot of argy-bargy and debating between the Greek government and the EU authorities, indeed between the European Commission on the one hand, the IMF, and the European Central Bank on the one hand, the Troika, and the Greek government. But in truth, all of the trump cards lay with the international authorities, and the Greeks were forced to get their public finances under control. The deficit continued for a bit. I'm afraid there was a terrible recession. The recession reduced output by about a quarter. So the ratio of debt to GDP, which had been reduced a bit by the default, moved up to about 180%. And you might say, surely this was hopeless. Well, it's been interesting what's happened, because since then there has been solid move back into surplus on the public finances. So if you exclude the interest payments, Greece has been running a surplus with an excess of tax payments over expenditure since 2013. That's now about 4% of GDP. The reduction in the increase in taxes is very clear from this chart. It's all enforced by the international bureaucracy. There's also been a cut in spending relative to GDP. And we come back 5, 6, 7 years after the crisis, and lo and behold, the ratio of interest payments to government debt have fallen. Let's just look at this chart again of the interest rate on Greek government debt, the 10-year bond, peaked at 30%. It came down to under 10%, bit in 2014 and then more definitely in 2017. And it's kept on coming down as the Greek government has done the right things. And this year in July, a centre-right government was elected under the New Democracy Party. The right things are again being done, the right things are being said, and so on. And the yield on Greek government debt, having been 30%, came down to single digits. Early this year was 4%, is now 1.5%. So the interest payments on the Greek government debt, having threatened to go to 40% of GDP, are now down to about 3% of GDP. And the situation is completely sustainable. This is a miracle. And one has to say, well, bless them, this is quite something. But to me, there are two wider lessons here. One is honesty always pays. If you're trying to sell debt to the financial markets and you are known to be dishonest and to be involved in basically systematic mendacity, of course the markets are going to punish you by asking for a higher interest rate. The higher interest rate then goes into the costs of running the debt, and that then makes the country poorer. So it's a good thing for a country that has a public debt to be honest about the size of its debts, and that will tend to keep the interest rate down. The second message is much wider, and this is that so-called Keynesian deficit financing is extremely risky and dangerous. Once the debt exceeds a certain level, the debt interest can run out of control, and the debt interest and the dynamics of the debt interest just exploding without limit come to dominate the situation. And this was what was threatening to happen in Greece 5 or 6 years ago. The right things have been done, debt has been brought under control, and so we have tidings of comfort and joy for Greece at the end of 2019, and let's hope that in 2020 things get even better there, and that the wider lesson that budget deficits are a bad idea is more generally learned and understood. Thank you.